And good evening again, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me all right. So, on this very stormy evening, we're going to try and work our way through two chapters of Fratelli, Tutti, chapters 5 and 6. So don't worry if some of you didn't get a chance to read all of that for this evening. It's not a problem. These are all things you can go back over and read in your own time anyway. And it's never any harm, maybe after a session, a few days even after a session, to go back and have a read over a chapter or a couple of chapters that we might have discussed. There's a lot in these two chapters, as you'll have noticed. And you'll also probably see that there's quite a bit of overlap and a lot of parallels starting to emerge. So some of what we encounter here in chapters 5 and 6 echoes aspects of what Francis is saying in chapter 4 and so on. And then they proceed in the remaining two chapters into kind of, again, other aspects, other dimensions of this social question that he's unpacking as he goes through the encyclical. So you'll notice a bit of repetition, and don't worry about that. As I said to you on the first evening that we met, I felt that there was a kind of a summative feel to this encyclical, that Francis was trying to sum up and reiterate many key aspects of his thinking. So that kind of comes out a little bit as we read the encyclical. The repetition is probably there for a reason. He's, again, just trying to kind of reinforce certain ideas, certain language as we proceed through the document. So what I'm going to do this evening, because there is a lot in these two chapters, and as before, I don't want to hog the conversation, so to speak. I'm just going to mention some of the areas and some of the items that I found particularly interesting in these chapters. And as we open it up for discussion then later, there may well be other things that I haven't mentioned that you guys found particularly interesting that you would like to discuss, or again, a key quote or a key section of a chapter that you'd like attention drawn to, so we can explore it more fully as we go. If we start maybe with chapter 5 and we look at some of the key items for discussion here, Francis wants us to explore what he describes as a better kind of politics. What might a better kind of politics look like? It suggests that politics currently perhaps leaves a lot to be desired, or could certainly be improved upon as an art or as a discipline. And I think what we can say is that we're moving here in this chapter and in the next chapter much more directly into the public sphere. What are our public responsibilities? How do we contribute to a healthy and vibrant political life? How do we serve and protect our political institutions? What is it that we can expect from politics, so to speak? And I think this is a very important chapter because we've heard it said, maybe rightly or wrongly, that there's a growing skepticism, particularly among younger people, about politics, politicians, governance. That may be an unfair generalization and probably not confined just to young people. But, people are, I think, becoming a little bit disillusioned, perhaps, with some of what they're seeing in the political arena. And it's not unsurprising, perhaps, that we've witnessed events such as Brexit, the election of President Trump a number of years ago, and so on. Because what, for me at least, that represents is a disillusionment and a disenfranchisement, if you like, among a certain population, a certain group of people who feel completely left behind by the political establishment, and are willing to take a chance, if you like, on a new idea, a new person, a new group, because they feel that the status quo currently says nothing and has nothing to say to them. Events in the US recently, the post-electoral sort of debacle, if you like, the storming of the Capitol in January, also illustrate very vividly the fragility of democracy. When we think of America, we very often think of it as almost the champion of democracy, again, rightly or wrongly. But it's a country that prides itself on the idea and the ideal of democracy. And yet, in a short space of time and with great ease, something like those events can happen. And I think there's a kind of a lesson there for all of us, not to take our political institutions for granted, not to take democracy for granted. And again, if we needed any further illustration of this, we could look to places like Myanmar, or indeed even closer to home, Russia, where we have an oligarchy for all intents and purposes, the rule of the few. So democracy is a precious thing. Our political structures are precious. And I suppose Francis is calling us here in this chapter to be critical by all means and to be engaged, but not to take them for granted either. And he's convinced that there's a better way in which we can do our politics. And this is what he really wants to explore and unpack here and throughout the document itself. So I suppose these kinds of examples, Trump, the storming of the Capitol, Myanmar, even things like the rise of the far right in many European countries and very close to home, illustrate the need for all of us to be vigilant and to be responsible when it comes to politics. And Francis, in paragraph 157, tells us that, democracy, he says, is government by the people. He says men and women are capable of coming up with shared goals that transcend their differences and can thus engage in a common endeavor. And again, traditionally, sort of the US was always a shining example of this idea, a melting pot of cultures and religions and ethnicity, of all of these migrants flowing into the country over a number of years, and yet able to have shared goals, a shared vision, and working together. Perhaps that's a little bit romantic, but it's always kind of portrayed in that sort of way. So this is politics at its best for Francis, the idea that we can come together in all of our diversity and work together and have shared goals and so on. Francis warns of what he describes as an unhealthy populism. He says when individuals are able to exploit politically a people's culture for their own personal advantage or continuing to grip to power, or when they seek popularity by appealing to the basest and most selfish inclinations of certain sectors of the population. So again, you can probably come up with lots of examples of the kind of either individuals or regimes to which Francis is referring there. But populism and populist regimes and political groups, they lack the depth, they lack the strength, they lack the roots, if you like, to be able to engage properly with what we call the common good and to do the business of governance, what government is actually about in the truest sense. And I think we need to probably ask ourselves, like, where does our Christian faith come into all of this? Catholic social teaching is the area of theology, of moral theology, which helps to guide us through some of these questions. It provides us with principles and concepts, benchmarks from which we can judge and respond and react to what we're seeing in society and in politics. So many of the principles, such as solidarity and an option for the poor, social justice, the empowerment of the marginalized, these kinds of ideas act as a counterbalance to rugged individualism and to narrow nationalism. And our Christian anthropology, and I keep referring to this in all of our sessions together, our Christian anthropology, how we see and understand ourselves and the human person, is critical here also. It's an inclusive anthropology, not a selective anthropology. It's demanding and it's inconvenient. It places burdens on us and costs on us. But if we truly believe in what we preach, that we believe that all human beings are made in God's image, then this inclusive anthropology has something to say to our politics as well, and to the kind of politics that's out there at the moment. And it is interesting, I think this is something that everyone needs to ask of themselves. It is interesting to think of how many Christian men and women of all Christian denominations supported President Trump both the first time round and, more interestingly, perhaps the second time round. 65 million people voted for him the second time round, having seen 4 years of what that kind of politics is like. And presumably not all of those 65 million were Christian, but quite a large percentage, I imagine, were. So where does our theology and our Christian faith come into our political decision making? And I think there's something that really needs to be examined in all of us. I mean, we can look to America and be critical or supportive or whatever from a distance, but there are those kinds of questions much closer to home that we need to ask of ourselves also. Populist groups and the kind of populism that Francis is warning us about here, it doesn't just fall from the sky. These populist groups emerge because of real and very understandable human fears, human concerns, and human needs. And it's probably, it's unhelpful to just be dismissive of that and to categorize or label people who would vote for President Trump or for Brexit or for whatever, without examining the actual human fears and human concerns that were driving this and fueling it. And one of the things that Francis here in this chapter identifies as a contributing factor to the rise of populism and so on is inequality. And if you guys look over paragraphs 161 and following, you'll see what he has to say about inequality. And I think it's really important and it's really interesting. We have to try to think how inequality affects and erodes and undermines democracy and the pillars that democracy rests upon. How does inequality erode our sense of civic responsibility? How might inequality erode this awful expression, buy-in from citizens? And study after study confirms that inequality, primarily economic inequality, but inequality is an enormous threat to democracy. Because the wider the gap, the less likely people are to trust in the governance structures of your place, in the people in charge of that, and so on. And we also know that where inequality is reduced, even in the poorest countries, you get far greater levels of civic participation because people can see that things are working. I might still be poor, but I'm less poor, and the gap between me and the person beside me has been reduced also. So I can buy in and trust in the process, so to speak. Inequality is an area that Catholic social teaching has not really developed as strongly as other areas and other ideas such as poverty, for example. And we can understand why. You look at the world's population at the moment, there's 7.8 billion of us approximately on the planet. And we know that the bottom billion of the world's population are locked in extreme poverty and they're not getting out of it. Okay? So we have huge issues of poverty in our world. We can see it around us in our own communities and in our own country. But when you look globally at levels of poverty, the number of people living on less than $1 a day, it's really quite horrifying. So you can understand why Catholic social teaching and the various documents, papal documents and so on, have put so much emphasis on poverty and on economic justice. But inequality is a slightly different animal. It's not unrelated. But inequality is about more than just economic issues. inequality then starts to permeate and erode all sorts of other social dimensions of our lives and of our, our society and of our country. And it is an area that's starting to gain more attention among moral theologians, particularly those coming from within Catholic social teaching. So I found it really interesting and very important that Francis does actually speak about this here in chapter 5 and looks at the way in which inequality is one of the contributing factors to things like the rise of populist groups and so on. And what he says is important here. He says eliminating inequality requires an economic growth that can help to tap each region's potential and thus guarantee sustainable equality. The word sustainable is critically important there. We know that those of us in the West are living way beyond our means. We also know that there are too many of us on the planet, right? The population of the world at the end of the First World War was about 980 million. 100 years approximately later, we're up to 7.8 billion, right? So we are mushrooming as a species. So sustainable equality is critical. We're not going to bring everyone up to our level. That's not sustainable. Therefore, what do we have to do? Those of us who are privileged and living in the West and have very high levels of lifestyle and living, what is it that we need to change? What are the priorities that we need to reorganize in order for a more sustainable way of living? So I think that's a really important and a very difficult question that we need to ask ourselves. Finally, in this section, just very briefly, he talks about work and the importance of work. And again, I was really interested to see mention of this here. He's echoing John Paul II, I imagine, in what he has to say here. John Paul wrote a document called the Boerm Exercise, and it's arguably the most important social document that John Paul wrote. And in it, he talks about the dignity of work and the importance of work for people. And this is another area that I think is going to become critically important in the next 20 to 40 years, perhaps. We already see how robots are doing the jobs of people. If you go into Tesco's, you go to a self-service checkout, you scan your own groceries and you leave. You don't have to interact with another person if you don't want to. The same in the banks and so on and so forth. And there are fewer personnel in a lot of these places. The point is that we are moving towards a society that is going to provide employment, more than likely, for the highly educated. So what does that say to other sections of society? And I think this is an area, the whole dignity of work, it's going to come back on the agenda. It's interesting that John Paul was writing about it, whatever it was, 30 years ago. It's coming back on the agenda now. You're all probably familiar with Sean McDonough's work in the area of ecology and climate justice and so on. He has a new book out, which might be of interest to some of you. I have it here. And it's called Robots, Ethics, and the Future of Jobs. And I think this is going to be one of the next big areas that moral theology and that the Catholic Church is going to need to respond to. And that, again, has a lot of riches in its tradition that can speak to these contemporary issues that we're facing. There's a lot more in this chapter that I could say, speak about, but I'm not going to because I'm very conscious of time. The final thing I'll say, just to move on to the second chapter that you'll have looked at for tonight, the importance of dialogue. In chapter 6, Francis speaks of dialogue and social friendship, and the importance, the critical importance of constructive dialogue. And he talks about dialogue between the generations also. We might talk about dialogue within the church. So who are the groups that need to come together? How do we have constructive conversations with each other, even though they may be very difficult conversations? How do we create a space in which constructive dialogue can take place? Francis talks about real dialogue versus fake news. And again, this is something that we're becoming more familiar with and we're seeing, every day on social media and so on. And the need to be able to decipher between fake news and real dialogue, constructive conversation, conversations that are informed, that are rooted in reality is one of the things he talks about also. And for Francis, real dialogue doesn't shy away from tough conversations. It's not about us all saying the kinds of things we want, we know we want people to hear or whatever it is. The tough conversations need to be had also. And as I was reading this section, the person who kept coming into my own mind was John Hume in the North. Somebody who didn't shy away from tough conversations, and many along with him, but also somebody who believed in the power of dialogue over and above the power of violence. And where you can create a space for constructive dialogue to happen, a safe space, a space where radically opposing opinions can be heard, then you can start to make progress. And that's the thing that just kept coming into my mind as I read this section. Francis also speaks of the need for greater interdisciplinary communication. And again, I liked that and I liked to hear that. From my own point of view, I suppose the area that I teach is very interdisciplinary. You can't do moral theology apart from economics and politics and anthropology and science and all of these other things. So I liked that Francis named that and that he saw the importance of that. And then he also goes on in paragraph 211 to say that in a pluralist society, dialogue is essential. And it is enriched by clear thinking, rational arguments, a variety of perspectives, and the contribution of different fields of knowledge and points of view. So human experience, in other words. This is really important. And this is something that's very positive and very exciting to me. And it's the kind of thing I would like to see happen both within society and within our church. There are two examples that I just want to give you here, one good and one bad, about what Francis is saying. And it's coming again from my own perspective and from my own discipline. We'll start with the negative. If you think of what Francis is saying there, okay, in a pluralist society, dialogue is essential. It's enriched by clear thinking, rational arguments, a variety of perspectives, and the contribution of different fields of knowledge and points of view. Okay, now he is speaking about society, but one of the criticisms that's leveled against Catholic social doctrine very often is that the church is here speaking to the world. And it's saying, here are the standards or here are the principles that we expect society to live by, but aren't applied perhaps as rigorously or as consistently to the internal workings of the institutional church. I don't think it's quite as black and white as that, but there's probably something in that criticism. The example I'm going to offer you is from the Congregation for Catholic Education. And it's a document that was written in 2019. It's entitled Male and Female, He Created Them, Towards a Path of Dialogue on the Question of Gender Theory in Education. So you've got dialogue right here in the title of this document from the Congregation for Education. So they're talking about gender theory, transgender people, and so on. There is no dialogue in this document. You can look it up and look at every source in the document. Every source cited is a magisterial document. So you have a magisterial document using other magisterial documents, but not dialoguing with people, for example, who are transgender or whatever it is. So not drawing from their experiences, from their insights, and so on. So it's just kind of, it's something that struck me as I was reading this particular section of, you know, as I said, the standards we want out there in society, but are we willing to apply the same standards internally in the life and in the mechanisms of the church? On a more positive note, however, there are examples of where dialogue is happening. I mean, across the board. Some of the dioceses in Ireland have had local synods, for example. But in my own experience, I, many years ago, was a member of a group called the New Wineskins. And it was back in the day when I was a young theologian. And the idea behind it is to get young moral theologians to come together to dialogue. Because I'm sure you know, moral theology is a very divisive area of theology. And unfortunately, as a theologian, you're put into one of two camps. You're either a liberal or you're a conservative. And it's rarely that simple. And those kind of categories don't do justice to many of us working in the field. But what this organization wanted to do was bring together young theologians, young moral theologians, to dialogue and discuss moral theology, irrespective of where they were coming from on a particular issue. So we could be at polar opposites in terms of whatever the topic might be, but that we're able to talk about it and we're able to share our ideas, share our knowledge, and at the end of the day, go off and have a pint or have a cup of coffee and still be talking to each other. And it comes out of a context, sort of the generation before, where, particularly after an event called the Charles Kern Affair, where theologians basically stopped talking to each other within moral theology. If I'm a liberal theologian, somebody else is a conservative theologian, we've nothing to say to each other. So this initiative wanted to kind of lose all of that baggage, get young moral theologians talking, irrespective of perhaps their very diverse and very polarized ideas on certain things. And it was a really great organization to be a part of. And it did involve very tough conversations, but we respected each other enough to listen to each other and to learn from each other and perhaps see new ways of thinking about something. So I think where you can get those initiatives going, even if they're quite local, very interesting things can come out of it. And that's part of what Francis is trying to encourage and promote here at a societal level. And he finishes towards the end of that chapter, and I'll leave it at this. He finishes with a really nice quote, which I suppose forms the title of our series of sessions. He says, "Life, for all its confrontations, is the art of encounter. If you don't encounter the other, we meet each other all the time. We're texting each other all the time. We're passing each other on the street all the time. But if we don't really encounter the person, encounter is not just meeting in a physical sense. It's respecting, it's seeing, it's understanding. So I really like that idea that life, for all its confrontations, is the art of encounter. And like any art, whether you're learning to play the piano or whatever it is you're trying to do, any art requires effort and time and investment on our part. And it requires us to be willing to say, I didn't get this right, I'm going to learn and I'm going to get better. And that's, I think if we're humble enough to recognize that in all our endeavors in society, in public life, in our parishes, in our homes, we can at least start to make progress.